Welcome back to MD-Sim 360, the Molecular Dynamics Masterclass. In this series, we'll walk you through each and every step of an MD simulation, explaining the inputs, outputs, their purpose, and the impact of each step. By the end, you'll have a clear understanding of what's happening at each stage, and you'll be able to replicate the process yourself. Today, we're going to focus on the NVT step. This step is crucial because we stabilize the system's temperature while keeping the volume constant. In the previous step, we worked on energy minimization. There, we eliminated any stress or atom overlaps and stabilized the system's energy. Now, in the NVT step, we take that relaxed system and focus on maintaining a constant temperature. This is important for simulations that mimic real-world behavior, where temperature fluctuations should be minimized. We want the temperature to stay as stable as possible. If the temperature increases, it should do so gradually and steadily, not rapidly. Let's break down the key parameters of this step. First, the general parameters are quite similar to those in the energy minimization step. The first is the neighbor list update frequency. This parameter defines how often the neighbor list is updated. For example, Gromacs may update the neighbor list every 20 steps to keep track of which atoms are nearby. Next, we have the neighbor list cutoff radius. This is the distance within which Gromacs considers atoms as neighbors. Not all atoms interact with each other, so this radius limits the number of interactions. Following that, we have the van der Waals interaction forces. This parameter defines the range of van der Waals forces, which are either attractive or repulsive interactions between atoms. It's controlled by a cutoff radius, just like the neighbor list. Then, we have the Coulomb interaction cutoff. This controls the electrostatic interactions between charged particles, and again, we set a cutoff distance for these interactions. Now, let's move on to the NVT-specific parameters, starting with the velocity rescaling thermostat. This is where things get interesting. In molecular dynamics, atoms are always moving, and their velocities directly relate to the system's temperature. Faster-moving atoms have higher kinetic energy, and this translates into higher temperature. The velocity rescaling thermostat controls temperature by adjusting the velocities of the atoms. If the system is too hot, the thermostat will slow down the atoms. If it's too cold, it speeds them up, keeping the system at a steady temperature. Next, we have the temperature coupling time constant. This constant determines how quickly Gromacs adjusts the system's temperature. A common setting for this is 1 picosecond, which means Gromacs will make adjustments every picosecond to ensure the temperature is stabilized. The reference temperature in our case is set to 303.15 Kelvin. This is the target temperature we want the system to maintain during the NVT step. We also need to address constraints. One key constraint is the hydrogen bond length constraint. During the energy minimization step, some bond lengths may have been stretched unnaturally. Here in the NVT step, we add a constraint to ensure that none of the bond lengths get distorted or stretched beyond their normal limits, particularly hydrogen bonds. Another important parameter is the initial temperature for velocity generation. This is the temperature used to assign the initial velocities to atoms in the system. It's crucial because it determines how fast the atoms will move at the start of the simulation. Once we've set all these parameters, we can click Run NVT to start the process. As the simulation begins, you'll see the progress bar filling up, indicating how far along the step is. NVT simulations take a bit longer than energy minimization, but this is when we really begin to stabilize the system's temperature. Keep in mind, simulations like these consume more computational resources, which is why the process might take a little longer. For our current system, with around 28,000 atoms, this step might take around 5 to 10 minutes to complete. During this time, I've set up notifications to alert me when the simulation finishes. So, while we wait for NVT to finish, you'll see that the system gradually stabilizes its temperature and sets the stage for the next steps in the simulation. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into each phase of molecular dynamics and bring the system closer to real-world behavior. Now that the NVT step is complete, it's time to dive into the results and analyze what's happening with our system. We'll be looking at a series of graphs that give us a deeper understanding of how things have evolved and stabilized during the simulation. Let's begin with the temperature graph. Earlier in the simulation, we saw a significant temperature fluctuation where the temperature dropped from about 300 Kelvin to roughly 244 Kelvin. This was a big shift, but eventually the system stabilized. As you can see in the graph, it has some minor fluctuations. But don't worry, that's completely normal. In the end, the system maintained an average temperature 303 Kelvin, which is right where we want it to be. Next, we look at the kinetic energy graph. Since temperature, kinetic energy, and velocity are all interdependent, the kinetic energy graph closely mirrors the temperature graph. As the atoms gain velocity, their kinetic energy increases, which is reflected in this graph. Now, let's move on to the total energy graph. This is a little different because total energy is the combination of both kinetic and potential energy. Initially, we see a large negative value for the total energy. But as the atoms begin to move and gain some velocity, energy is consumed, and you can see the total energy stabilizing. This is exactly what we want to see. The important thing to note here is that during an NVT simulation, the total energy graph should eventually stabilize. A stable total energy value means the system is properly equilibrated. Moving on, we have the Coulomb short-range interaction graph. As expected, this graph stabilizes over time as the atoms adjust and interact according to their charge distributions. Similarly, the Lennard-Jones short-range interaction graph also shows a stabilization pattern. Initially, the values are higher, but over time, as the atoms settle into a more stable configuration, indicating atoms' forces stability. Lastly, we have the pressure graph. You can see that the pressure isn't fully stable yet, and that's okay for now. In the next step, we'll focus on stabilizing the pressure to make everything balanced. The NVT step is absolutely essential because it allows the system to reach equilibria. Why is this so important? Well, the production run is highly resource-intensive. If we skip the NVT step, we risk introducing errors or instability into the simulation. By carefully equilibrating the system first, we minimize the chances of encountering problems during production phase. And that's a wrap on the NVT step. It's a vital process that sets the foundation for a successful production run, so it's ready for what comes next.